should I say? If the honorable senators and members permit me, should I use the word hound the parliaments all over the world during this COVID crisis, how to deal with the essentials of legislation when the physical contact has meant the spread of the pandemic. We have been witnessing many challenges with the development agenda, the global development agenda. What we saw was the 2007-2008 finances, but more something that reached the people of Pakistan and in particular, and the people of South Asia in general, was the rise of global terrorism in the post 9/11 situation. It was exactly the same time when the international community agreed upon the MDGs. And at the same time, our region was hit by this kind of epidemic, the epidemic of terrorism. And so in 2015, when the world met again to review the development agenda, what we found was these countries, including Pakistan, they were not able to meet the targets, primarily because of the fact that we had more urgent challenges in front of us in terms of the displacement of people, the rise in suicidal attacks, and its impact on the economy. So now, when the world has moved to the SDGs and has set a new time frame for global harmonious development agenda, what we have witnessed is that now we have been hit by this kind of a phenomena, which was quite unheard of. At least no one living at the moment had ever witnessed such a thing in his life or her lifetime. But now this is a challenge, and this is something that the parliaments have to look into, because this is the mandate of the parliaments to seek solutions to the problems of their electorate. And this is quite a strong challenge. How would the parliaments react to it? And what would be our modus operandi in dealing with this crisis? Not only the fact how the very first challenge in front of the parliaments is how are they going to meet in such emergency situation. Number two, how are they going to allocate resources? Because the budgetary strings all over in the democratic world is in the hands of the parliaments. And the parliaments decide the budgets according to the needs and urgencies of their electorate. And what we saw was that all over the world, all of a sudden, health became the main issue. And after the issue of health, food security became the issue. So how are we going to divert the resources from the pre-fixed heads? This is another challenge that the parliaments have to see. So with these words, I would like to invite the convener of the SDGs task force in the Parliament of Pakistan, Honorable Member National Assembly, Mr. Riaz Fatyana. Mr. Riaz Fatyana is also the chairman of the Standing Committee on Law and Justice. So over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Shamoon Hashmi. I'm grateful. The first case of COVID-19 was diagnosed and detected in Karachi on 26th February 2020. And later on, we reached around 3 lakh people in Pakistan who were affected by COVID. And Pakistan's government immediately started and announced a complete lockdown of government offices, parliament, everything, schools. And later on, we announced a smart lockdown. This was a new phenomenon in the COVID-19 area pandemic. So lately, we also affected by climate change. And that was another problem which we faced, especially in Karachi. You can see streets are converted in lakes and streams. So government actually did too much, which we can expect from the government. They announced the SARS program, and provided cash support to 17 million homes, families, not people, but families. And especially we provided infrastructure support and government department support to people of the country. We created a campaign for awareness of the people that how they can protect themselves. We also enhanced confidence of the people on government and departments, and later on, due to our wise strategy, we interestingly drawn the ratio of COVID-19 patients in Pakistan speedily. At present, we have only few thousand people which are active patients and are under treatment in their homes. We assume that the first phase of COVID-19 was very dangerous when people were very afraid and they didn't get psychological and family support. People were being shifted forcibly to hospitals, and there was most deaths were due to fear and without psychological support. Later on, government announced that people can stay in their homes. When this policy was shifted, we can see that the rate of deaths was reduced, and because everything was in safe hands of their family, and they got family support and psychological support, and ratio of fear was dropped. So there was missing part of mental health and psychological support, but later on we provided. Parliament's role was oversight the issue. Unfortunately, Parliament was also closed. After a few months, this was open because there was an issue of how we can pass our national annual budget. So from June onward, with some mayors, Parliament was working, and at present, all parliamentary standing committees and special committees and Parliament is working fully. Upper House and Senate and Lower House, National Assembly, both are working. So now this is the time that how we can continue our effort to ensure people that COVID-19 is going down, but still due to Eid al-Zuha and now Muharram al-Haram, there is risk that due to mass interaction with people in between each other, this is possible that we may face a second wave of COVID-19 in Pakistan. But anyhow, with the help of all departments, Parliament, and civil society, and of course, all stakeholders are working together. Government and opposition are on the same page because there is no politics on this issue. This is our national challenge, and we are in process to motivate people that they should at least again and now implement SOP. They should wear masks, they should have distance, and they should wash their hands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Member Fatyana, for your kind remarks. With this, I would like to invite Shahryar Khan on behalf of the National Dialogue Forum, who's also the mover and shaker of this webinar, to add a few words to this conversation.
Thank you, Shamoon. I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the National Dialogue Forum. We are a non-partisan public policy organization striving to promote peace, social cohesion through research, policy advocacy, and capacity building programs to pave way for a democratic, progressive, and inclusive Pakistan. One of NDF's key objectives is to contribute to the quality and efficacy of legislation in Pakistan by strengthening the rule of law in the country. NDF's parliamentary strengthening initiatives are aimed to increase the capacity of Pakistani law drafters and legislators, both on the national and provincial level, to draft good and effective legislation. I would like to thank our international partners, the Max Planck Foundation for International Peace and Rule of Law, for making this event possible and by providing access to renowned international experts for various local capacity building initiatives. I would like to thank David and Ayesha for joining us. I would also like to thank Seidel Foundation in Islamabad for their unrelenting support I would also like to thank the respected legislators, both from the Senate and National Assembly, for taking out time from their busy schedules to join us today. In the end, I would also like to thank Shamoon Hashmi, Additional Secretary, National Assembly, Hassan Hakim at the Parliamentary SDGs Secretariat, the drafters team at the National Assembly, and the Pakistan Institute for Parliamentary Services. I hope this session will be educational, illuminating, and will pave way for further such interactions and continued international cooperation for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Riaz, for your quick and crisp remarks. You have rightly acknowledged all the partners. You have also mentioned the development partners. A challenge in the developing world, which the legislators in the parliaments often face, is that somehow or the other, the global development agenda is taken or mistaken as an NGO agenda, whereas it is not an imposed international kind of an agenda, but it is the homegrown answer to the problems for which we are facing. For example, what has happened is that what we have seen is that this COVID has been affecting all the segments of the human society in one way or the other. For example, the way the education of the students has been badly affected. More than 1.5 billion students have not been able to attend their classes. So education sector has been hit. I've already talked about the food crisis and the health sector, the informal labor force. There was no job at the street for all those people who were lining up the streets waiting for food. So somehow or the other, this realization that the development partners, the civil society, and the parliaments have to work hand in hand to address the challenges has to be given priority. In this regard, I would request Meher Gavas on behalf of the Seidel Foundation to add a few words. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much. Good morning and Assalamu alaikum, and thank you again for the introduction, and very happy to be here along with the National Dialogue Forum and with Max Planck Foundation for International Peace and Rule of Law and other distinguished colleagues over here today. I'm also very honored to have amongst us leading Pakistani international legislators. It is certainly good to hear from the Honorable Mr. Fatyana on this topic, this very important topic. Today, through this platform, the Seidel Foundation intends to support a discussion on creating emergency legislation in Pakistan, how such legislation can be created in times of pandemics such as the COVID-19 situation that we've been having, not just in Pakistan, but across the whole world, And, countries around the world have been addressing how best to resist these kind of challenges and pandemics. Questions come such as how can one best create emergency legislation in such times, amongst other insightful discussions and answers. So, platforms such as these always give us an opportunity to learn from one another and to share experiences. Today's event is part of a series of online sessions where leading legislators, practitioners will come together to share their insights on important legislative matters. I hope that it will be an insightful experience for all of us. And I'm very grateful for all of you distinguished colleagues to be here and to be involved. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Meher. I can see Imogen here. Imogen Canavan has been our partner, very valuable partner. And in the pre-COVID scenario, we were planning something big for the parliament, and then we were hit by the COVID. She represents the Max Planck Foundation for International Peace and Rule of Law. Floor is yours, Imogen.
Thank you, Shamoon. And I'm pleased to say that our event was postponed and not cancelled. So we hope to be back in Pakistan soon. On behalf of the Max Planck Foundation for International Peace and the Rule of Law, I'm delighted to support this webinar series. And the pandemic has affected all of us. And I'd like to thank our local partners, and Shamoon's already enunciated on the importance of working at different levels with the Parliament, with international support, but also the local partners. And so a huge thank you to the National Dialogue Forum and the Seidel Foundation for their commitment to our collaboration. And they've demonstrated versatility and to overcome these challenges. But it's also parliaments who have to overcome this challenge too. The pandemic has really tested the adaptability of our constitutions and procedures in an unprecedented manner. And as we have a second wave threatening us, this webinar could not be more timely. It's a chance to reflect on the challenges faced by legislators and legislative drafters, and to learn from the experiences of each other to mitigate and navigate what is likely to be another unpredictable period in front of us. So today we're addressing emergency legislation, and I hope in our next webinar we can also address ordinary legislation with a view to looking at what our new normal is going to be. Of course, we really would prefer to be with you in Pakistan today, but I do appreciate the opportunity we've had to have David and Ayesha and Bryn all join us from different countries, from New Zealand, from the Maldives and Germany today. So thank you all for joining us. As well as a huge thank you to those joining us in Pakistan, from the Senate, from the National Assembly, and from PIPS as well. So thank you. I'm really looking forward to the discussions, and the floor is back to you, Shamoon. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Imogen. Arbab Sher has joined us, Honorable Member of the National Assembly of Pakistan and also the Chairman of the CPEC Committee. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. And you have joined us at the very appropriate time because of the fact that we have three important keynotes at the moment from three different countries. So a global perspective for the Pakistani parliamentarians is now on the table. One is from Germany, which is exploring the impact of the pandemic on the relationship between the executive and the legislature, which is by Brian Guthrie. She represents the Max Planck Foundation for International Peace and Rule of Law. The other keynote would be by Honorable David Wilson from the New Zealand House of Representatives, and he would be talking about considering expedient parliamentary procedures to press emergency legislation. And the third from our own region, from the SAARC region, is by Ms. Ayesha Naeem. She represents the Attorney General's Office of the Maldives, and she would be talking about drafting emergency legislation during the pandemic. So I start with Germany. Let's say from the developed world, how they coped with this challenge of making parliament relevant during such a crisis. Brian, the floor is yours, and you're talking about exploring the impact of the pandemic on the relationship between the executive and the legislature. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shamoon, and thank you very much for having me today. It's really an honor to speak to all of you on a topic that is, as everyone has said, so important and will become even more important as our new normal develops and as our changing world, as our world changes rather, to accommodate the regulations and the different needs that COVID brings about. So as Shamoon said, I am based in Germany, but I'm actually South African. So I hope that you will allow me to indulge in what I hope will be a comparative discussion about a number of different approaches that states around the world have taken. And I hope you'll indulge me to speak a little bit about my home country as well. So firstly, I think that there have been a number of buzzwords that have kind of come out around this pandemic. We've said it's unprecedented times. We've called them challenging times. Some government officials have declared war on COVID. And I guess it's understandable in the sense that it's a highly infectious disease that we know very little about. And in dealing with it, we've needed to limit a number of fundamental rights and freedoms. And we've needed to suspend things that are such an ordinary part of everyday life, whether it's school, work, university, or just everyday movement. In reality, the COVID pandemic has changed everything about the way that we interact with one another and interact with society. And that includes the way that the executive, the legislature, and the courts interact with one another through our traditional understanding of the separation of powers. So I guess a first premise that I'd like to discuss is really that there's been a trend around the world that in dealing with this COVID pandemic, there's been an amassing of executive power in a manner that I would say is akin to a state of emergency, or what we would see in traditional states of emergency. And there's a lot of classical scholarship around why it is necessary that in particular emergency situations, the executive takes certain powers in terms of decision making and even in terms of legislating. And this scholarship is, you know, it speaks to the fact that decisions need to be quick. They need to be decisive rather than deliberative. And sometimes they need to be based on things such as confidential material when you're thinking about a war, an enemy aggressor, even things such as financial crises. And I would say that the COVID pandemic is sure analogous in some ways to these traditional states of emergency, in that we needed a very swift response, we needed a decisive response, but it also has key differences to what we classically think of as the things that give rise to states of emergency, in that there's less of an information asymmetry between different arms of government, in that often information about the pandemic is held with health professionals rather than the executive, or that there needs to be collaboration between private and public bodies and different sectors. But more than that, we have no idea how long this is going to go on for. We don't know if there's going to be a second wave, a third wave, whether this is the new normal, and it's affected the rights and liberties of individuals en masse around the world. It's not in a limited location. And so what that means is that sure, there's this classical scholarship on you know, states of emergency and the need to amass executive powers in these kinds of emergencies. But if this is going to become the new normal, that also re-emphasizes the importance of the separation of powers and the need for checks and balances that it gives rise to. So I think if we start to look at the way that different countries have reacted to this pandemic, of course, we first recognize that it's been very difficult for parliaments in such a situation. The fact is that a lot of people gathering together in a small chamber is an infection risk. The fact is that often parliamentarians need to travel from different parts of the country to get to their Congress. And when there are travel bans or movement restrictions, that becomes increasingly difficult. Also, parliaments take time to pass legislation, and that is the antithesis of the swift response that we've spoken about needing for this pandemic. Of course, there are also procedural bars, such as the need to amend the rules of parliament or the rules of procedures, or even in some cases, such as in Switzerland, the need to amend the constitution so that parliaments could sit virtually. And so states have kind of taken one of two responses in terms of dealing with the pandemic. So either they've taken a legislative response to giving certain powers to the executive, and this would be through passing either new legislation, relying on existing legislation, or amending existing legislation, which allows parliaments to delegate certain lawmaking powers around an emergency to the executive. And here countries such as Germany, France, Australia, South Africa have all followed this approach, where they've relied on a piece of legislation that allows the government to declare either a state of emergency or a state of a health disaster. And in terms of that, to amass certain powers to create legislation related specifically to that crisis that is covered in terms of that piece of legislation. The second approach is, I guess, the constitutional approach, where states have declared formal constitutional states of emergency. And I'd say that this happens in probably has happened in a minority of cases, but examples include Spain, Hungary, Senegal. And here there are, of course, whatever checks and balances exist within those constitutional provisions. So if those are the two existing methods or general methods that states have perhaps pursued in order to address this and in order to give certain powers to the executive, what is the role of parliament in each of those? How does parliament, even if certain legislating powers have been removed from them and delegated to the executive, deal with that? So of course, there is the direct role that parliament plays in all of that. So if the legislative approach was taken, that means potentially drafting new legislation to deal specifically with COVID and empower the executive to take legislative decisions in terms of that legislation, or amending legislation. And here there are a lot of examples where countries, for instance, have amended legislation to build in new oversight procedures. So Japan, for instance, amended their existing public health legislation to require that the government reports to Parliament periodically about the COVID situation. Or Germany amended their public health legislation to ensure that any regulations which were promulgated in terms of that legislation were approved by Parliament. Or countries such as Liberia, New Zealand have set up separate oversight committees in terms of that empowering legislation and amendments made to that empowering legislation. So the direct impact or the direct role of Parliament in such a situation, I guess, is kind of understandable. Similarly, where countries relied on the constitutional approach, it's often the role of Parliament either to declare a state of emergency or to approve that state of emergency after a particular period of time, or even review that state of emergency in terms of when the government asks for an extension. So for instance, in Spain, the government declared a state of emergency in terms of the constitution. And then every 2 weeks, essentially, in order to extend that, Parliament needs to hold the debate, have reports from government in order to declare that that extension happens. So the direct role in terms of both approaches is quite clear. But what happens when oversight is less clear, when it isn't built into the legislation, and when it isn't perhaps as obvious? And here I'd like to turn to the South African example. So in South Africa, we declared a state of disaster, which is not something that is contained in the Constitution, but rather something that is contained in the Disaster Management Act. And the Disaster Management Act doesn't provide for any legislative oversight. In fact, it provides that a state of disaster can be declared for 3 months, and after that 3-month period, the minister, rather than Parliament, can extend that state of disaster in perpetuity. And it's interesting because the decision by government to rely on this act, this Disaster Management Act, was in spite of the fact that we have a constitutional provision that allows for the declaration of a state of emergency, and we have other legislation that allows for declarations of states of emergency or variants of a state of emergency, but also require legislative oversight. So it's an interesting dichotomy where essentially the state chose an option that they chose to rely and invoke a power in an act that also simultaneously removed the powers of Parliament in terms of oversight. And that's difficult, because what then can Parliament do? How can they ensure that their oversight role is not eroded? There are a couple of lessons from around the world that might be instructive. So first and foremost, I think it is, of course, difficult in these times to have things such as debates in the plenum, where it's very hard for parliamentarians to meet en masse. But we've seen innovative approaches to the way that technology can be used. And we've seen innovative approaches even to creating hybrid parliaments, where, for instance, certain members have been allowed to come into the central meeting area, and others have been included in those discussions using technology. And that's whether they are far away and can't get there because of travel restrictions, or because they're part of a risk group. And those kind of hybrid solutions are useful because it means that you can still have the general oversight function of having the government make statements in the plenum and having a basic debate around those statements. And so parliaments who place those government statements on their agenda mean that they can continue to ask questions around that. The Netherlands is a good example of this, where thankfully their chamber was essentially big enough that certain parliamentarians could have their meetings in a socially distanced fashion. And what they did was they had weekly debates where government representatives, the Prime Minister, as well as experts from health sectors, etc., would come in and they would make statements to Parliament. And this was not in terms of any piece of legislation that required it, but rather because parliamentarians themselves called for this by placing the making of such statements on the agenda. The second way, I suppose, of doing this and ensuring that oversight continues is by things such as questioning, and so traditional questioning mechanisms, both in the plenum and at the committee level. And I think that that's one of the big takeaways here, is that the committees in terms of oversight have been particularly effective, or offer the opportunity to be particularly effective, because smaller groups of people can perhaps meet more easily over online platforms. And so calling on representatives of government to make representations about the work that they are doing, either in the plenum, if you have a hybrid system and it's possible, or in the committee stages, can be extremely useful. And here we can look at the fact that in the UK, things such as question time went ahead, or even that parliamentary select committees are holding inquiries and hearing evidence electronically. So it may require a slight change in the rules of procedure of those committees, but committees can continue to work and can continue to have inquiries into issues around COVID and around these kinds of problems. Another way of approaching oversight is by the creation of ad hoc committees within Parliament who carry out COVID inquiries. And this would be the creation of essentially a separate ad hoc committee, which Parliament is disposed to do, in order to look at the way that COVID regulations or COVID approaches are taken. Again, they then have all of the evidence gathering mechanisms. And I suppose instead of having separate committees based on the different portfolios, you can have one central committee based specifically around COVID. Belgium and the UK are good examples of this. And of course, I think that in terms of the way that we look at our traditional oversight mechanisms, whether it's budgetary oversight, where of course you need as much information as possible to carry out that oversight. I think it's important that you think about the way that transparency can be enhanced in times of COVID, the way that technology means that you can be innovative, and the way that even when the legislation that empowers the executive to amass certain powers doesn't empower you to exercise oversight, you are able to be creative and adapt your existing mechanisms to ensure that parliamentary oversight continues. It appears that the most successful instances where parliaments have been able to be involved in this COVID-19 crisis is where they have recognized the need to change how they operate, how they treat the emergency situation, and how they view their role, because this is going to continue for a long time. And I think that we need to think about the way that parliaments can balance that, because at some stage this might become the new normal, and then we don't want all power concentrated in the executive. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. I'm being told to wrap up, so I'm going to leave it at that. But those are just a few ideas, and I'd be happy to discuss more about the way that different countries have used them around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. It was a very elaborate summary of the international experiences, and I guess we need to have a transcription of whatever you have said, because these provide some very good examples. I would move to David Wilson, who represents the New Zealand House of Representatives, and David would be talking about considering expedited parliamentary procedures to pass emergency legislation. You have got 10 minutes, David, and I request you to please kindly adhere to the time. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Shamoon, and well, good evening, everyone. It's Tuesday night here for me. It's a pleasure to be talking to you all. And following Bryn's global focus, I'm going to take a much narrower one on a small country in South Pacific, New Zealand. Just by way of background, our first case of COVID-19 was reported on the 28th of February of this year. The government put in place an alert level system, and on the 25th of March, we went into a 4-week nationwide lockdown. Before that happened, the Parliament took a variety of decisions to ensure that it could operate, not at full capacity, but effectively during the lockdown, because members of Parliament all agreed that they would observe the restrictions that applied to all other New Zealanders. So a small group of ministers stayed in Wellington, the capital, to manage the crisis, but most members of Parliament went home and sheltered in place like everybody else. So the House made a variety of temporary changes to its procedures so it could function under these restrictions. The restrictions lasted until the 8th of June, where we'd had about a month with no more cases of COVID-19, and then the restrictions were removed apart from border controls. There's been another small outbreak which caused one of our cities to be locked down, but basically there's 4 or 5 cases of COVID-19 in the country. So we're in quite a fortunate position, I think, having a small population, very little population density, and of course being an island, 2,000 kilometres away from our nearest neighbour. So we've been, I think, quite fortunate, but we still had to prepare for the pandemic and the lockdown very quickly, because events moved quickly and the government needed to act fast to, to safeguard the people. I think the key mechanism for us was our business committee, which is a cross-party parliamentary committee chaired by the Speaker. I'm an advisor to it as the Clerk of the House, and there are members of every party on it. It operates on a consensus basis and has all parties on it, and so it's become a real decision-making body for the Parliament, which has delegated more and more decision-making power to it. But it's also been a place that has experimented with new procedures, even in more settled times than we're in at the moment. And so it was in quite a good position to think about how we would address the restrictions under lockdown. And it was instrumental in setting up our Epidemic Response Committee, so a dedicated committee to oversee the government response to the pandemic. It was involved in the agreement that all the parties reached that the House wouldn't sit during the lockdown period. And the Epidemic Response Committee would stand in for Parliament effectively in scrutinising government activity. So shortly before the lockdown, the House sat and agreed some sessional orders, so some temporary changes to our standing orders, our rules of procedure. It passed some emergency legislation to empower the government to be able to take action effectively without having to refer to the Parliament all the time, and it passed an imprest supply bill to fund all of this as well, which has been supported by a significant amount of government borrowing. Once that was done, the House didn't sit for a month, and the Epidemic Response Committee really took the centre stage, I think. It was chaired by the Leader of the Opposition and had an opposition majority. Those have been very unusual things in New Zealand. Some chairs are opposition members, but the Leader of the Opposition wouldn't normally chair a committee, and the government usually ensures it has a majority on committees. But because the focus of this one was on scrutinising the actions of the government, they took a different approach. The committee met virtually over Zoom. It didn't ever meet in person because sessional orders had been put in place to permit that. And it focused its meetings on questioning ministers and senior public servants about the epidemic response. So the committee met every day that the House would normally sit, and it took its role quite seriously as being a substitute for the House as much as possible. It also considered very quickly some legislation related to COVID-19 and reported back to the House on that once the House was sitting again. But that committee was a really important focus. And the other interesting thing about it is it was watched by a lot of New Zealanders. We televised the meetings of the committee and webcast them as well. And about 1 in 6 New Zealanders watched it at some point because they wanted news about what was happening, and also because they saw ministers being questioned for extended periods of time about what the government was doing. There were some other changes made as time progressed as well. Changes to our standing orders around how we voted in the House and the number of members that had to be present, so that when the House did start to sit again, it could keep some physical distancing in place. A smaller number of members were able to travel to Wellington. Those who had to stay at home in their electorates could do that. But parties were able to cast all of the votes that they would normally cast. We also moved away from a lot of paper-based procedures to electronic ones for lodging of motions and papers and things like that. Things that would normally be done in person, we changed to make them virtual instead. And the business committee, as I say, was heavily involved in making these decisions, and it met every week online to make decisions. It made some other decisions about expediting legislation as well. So normally where legislation is referred to a committee, that's debated. They did away with those debates. There's normally also a delay between bills being reported from a parliamentary committee back to the House and them being able to be debated again. And they removed that in order to facilitate the legislation moving more quickly. And I think one of the key factors for us is that the opposition was supportive of the government's activity generally. Although they scrutinised them and criticised some things that they didn't think were very effective, generally they supported what it was doing. And one of the previous speakers has mentioned how that's important. It's not a political issue. So the House was quite cooperative in terms of facilitating the rapid passage of legislation around COVID-19, and parties also operated with a high degree of mutual trust. This could have been challenging because we have a general election in a few weeks, and so in election year there's a greater incentive for parties to differentiate themselves from each other, and of course for the opposition to try and become the government. But there was a high level of trust and cooperation, and so the House was often able to pass legislation very quickly, sometimes within a day, without having to take urgency or without having to do it against the will of the minority parties. But speedy legislation, of course, has risks. Our normal process for a bill is that all of them are referred to a parliamentary committee for 6 months to hear public submissions, to scrutinise the bill and to try and improve it. Where that's bypassed, there are some dangers. And one of the bills that was passed, there was a COVID-19 response bill passed through all stages of the House on one day, that without the knowledge of members established a small business loan scheme, essentially by accident. It had been something that was in an earlier draft of the bill. It was not in the copy of the bill circulated to other parties for consultation, but was in the copy that was introduced on the floor of the House and on the table of the House. And so ultimately was the one that was passed. Members didn't, for the most part, find out they'd done that until after it was passed. And so, I mean, that is a really serious warning about passing things probably too quickly, or perhaps them not getting the level of scrutiny they needed. It was a human error. There was no intentional deceit involved. But you know, I guess it's a warning that you can put good systems in place, you can cooperate and do things quickly, but it's still possible to make significant mistakes. So this loan scheme is still operating. As I said, most bills in New Zealand go to a committee for 6 months. Sometimes for emergency legislation, whether it's related to the pandemic or not, it goes through much faster, but the Parliament usually tries to put bills in front of a committee, even if it's just for a week, to hear expert evidence and to improve the legislation. And I think a good example is the emergency changes to our firearms legislation following the terrorist attacks on mosques in New Zealand on the 15th of March last year. Within the space of a week, the Parliament outlawed a variety of weapons that have been used in these murders. And even in that case, where there was a high degree of urgency and strong public feeling, those bills went to a committee for a week for some scrutiny. So I think one lesson would be that even if you only have a short time, a bill having time with a small group of people where they can scrutinise it in detail is really worthwhile. The final thing I mention is the model in New Zealand was the government, under emergency management legislation, public health legislation, was able to exercise emergency powers without needing further authority of the Parliament. And it could make orders that in an emergency, in an epidemic, that had been authorised by primary legislation, but without further reference to the House. And so one of the things the Parliament did was to establish some mechanisms for scrutinising these things. And while they recognise the executive is best placed to act in an emergency, they also recognise that parliamentary scrutiny was important. And so the orders that were made around public health were subject to scrutiny by our secondary legislation committee called the Regulations Review Committee. These orders could only be approved or extended after the committee had scrutinised them and reported on them, or the time for it to do that had passed if it chose not to. And that was quite an important break, I think, on unchecked executive authority. It was scrutiny and approval. In some instances, the House, because it supported these things, approved them unanimously without that scrutiny, but that would have not been possible if parties hadn't supported it. In declaring a state of emergency, ministers had to report that to the House as well. While the House wasn't sitting, we came up with a new method of doing that to make sure members knew about it anyway. So I think from the New Zealand experience, parliaments need to be able to make rapid changes in times like this. And I think for us, we don't have a codified constitution, which can make these things a lot faster. We're a unicameral parliament as well, and we have a small number of members, 120. And usually 5 or 6 parties in our parliament. So it's relatively easy, if there's the will, to make changes quite quickly. And that needed to be done because we went into lockdown within the space of 24 hours. It worked, as I say, because the opposition supported what was happening. Scrutiny of legislation, when it's being expedited in a day or two, is incredibly important. And I hope the example I gave is a good reminder of the need to really focus on the detail of it, even when it's passing through very quickly and even when everyone supports it. Even a short amount of time of committee consideration, I think, is always worthwhile. And then I think finally, if there are going to be powers exercised in an emergency, it's really important to think about what sort of parliamentary oversight there will be. That might not necessarily be approval of everything. The executive is there to act after all. But I think there's definitely a role for Parliament in testing how well those things are going and, if necessary, putting some checks on them. So that's just a very quick overview of what's been happening in New Zealand. I look forward to answering any questions about it later, but just conscious of time, I'll finish there and pass back to Shamoon.